Thank you, Jonathan.
Sorry about that. Sorry for the interruption.
That's all right. It's nothing like school. I mean, you get interruptions all the time when you teach.
Don't encourage it.
I'm used to interruptions. So the Whigs were a tour de force. They had these amazing homes in the country. They had huge amounts of money to spend on their beautiful homes. They could extend them. They could spend a huge amount of money on furnishing their homes. So those of you who like going to these places will know, even today, they are lavishly designed, and the decor and the furniture and everything is absolutely top quality. And they showed off. They were sort of in competition with each other. So they dictated the standards of culture for everybody else. Middle class people sort of aped, copied the aristocracy, and tried to follow the way they dressed and the fact that they had servants and so on. There were some nouveau riche. Not all the Whigs could trace their ancestry way back into the Middle Ages. Some of them had made their money through commerce, slavery, of course, and they were seen as perhaps a little bit dodgy, but they were accepted as long as they got the money and they could keep up. They could keep up these amazing high standards. They were eventually accepted. So the Tories, on the other hand, were the landed gentry. It included Jacobite sympathisers, so the Tories were seen as a bit dodgy, not totally loyal to the crown. And of course, just people who hated the Whigs. They hadn't got any particularly strong political beliefs or values. They just didn't like the Whigs because of their power and their dominance. There was no such thing as a party programme. There was no such thing as a party manifesto. So in that regard, politics was nothing like it is today. And if you challenged them and said, well, what do you believe in? They would have had beliefs, they would have had values, but they would have been hard put to write it down and form what we regard, what we know as a manifesto. The House of Commons was also aristocratic. House of Lords, obviously, you know, the name tells you that was full of aristocrats, earls, dukes, marquises. The House of Commons was also very aristocratic. It was the younger sons, basically. MPs were not paid until 1908, so you had to have private means in order to be able to live in London and be an MP. Very few of our ancestors had voting rights. Very few. And most of the developing towns and cities, because of the Industrial Revolution, they didn't have MPs. They had to rely on the MPs that represented their county. So the whole system was really becoming more and more out of date and requiring reform. Reform didn't happen until the 19th century. Bribery, something we are very sensitive about in this country. Bribery and corruption, we are against it. Jobs for the boys, we think this is wrong. Recent events are revealing that the press get hold of something and they make a big thing of it, because we are very much disapproving of people bribing their way to getting a contract or a job for a member of the family. But our ancestors in the 18th century would have been astonished if they had come back, if they could come back to life and live now. They would be absolutely amazed at how sensitive we are now, because they lived with bribery. It was a fact of life. Corruption was a major issue. Vote rigging, bribes. It was it's been estimated that 50% of the MPs in the House of Commons took bribes in order to give their vote to the right individual Act of Parliament, so that they would vote according to how big the bribe was, basically. And there are all sorts of factions and different groups, so you could get bribed by several groups, which was, you know, if you didn't think it was a terrible thing, you would be laughing all the way to the bank. You'd be thinking, oh, what a great idea this is. They are bribing me, and I'm open to suggestions. I haven't got any strong feelings about this particular issue. I will just keep on taking bribes. And it wasn't seen as really wrong, except by a small group of, say, religious people or people with very high standards. But the vast majority were bribable. We found that really quite shocking. The monarch had the right to select the Prime Minister and influence political decisions, politics and policies in a way that our Queen is not supposed to. She's supposed to be totally impartial, not give her opinion on anything, because she's supposed to be completely above politics. Well, this period in our development as a constitutional monarchy and democracy was kind of a halfway house. The monarch did have very strong opinions and did say what he thought about various policies and various proposals. And again, that seems to us, that seems very odd for a constitutional monarch. So the monarch could select the Prime Minister and interfere in politics and give opinions, but couldn't dismiss the Prime Minister from office. So we're sort of getting there. But if you think about it, Queen Victoria had very strong opinions. She was a constitutional monarch, very proud of the fact, well, Britain was very proud of the fact that we were different from other countries in Europe. We were way ahead in development, so it was seen, that we were civilized. But Queen Victoria had very strong opinions about various politicians and ministers. It's a very recent development that the monarch can't express opinions about cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister in particular. And it makes them seem rather, it makes the Queen seem rather dull. Some people have said, you know, how dull she is to talk to, but that's because she is being so careful and not expressing opinions. It would have been interesting to know what she was going to say about Matt Hancock before the Prime Minister interrupted and she said, he's full of, and then Boris interrupted and said, beans. It would have been interesting to know what the Queen was going to say, because she doesn't often speak in such a personalised way. So perhaps that's why Boris interrupted. He was probably frightened what she was about to say about Matt Hancock. So turning to Lord Bute, who's the first important minister in George's reign. He'd come to power in quite an unusual way. So back to George's family, Prince Frederick. Prince Frederick had met Lord Bute, who was a Scottish nobleman of very limited means when he met him, and he found him very congenial. They saw eye to eye on a number of issues. A lot of people found Lord Bute very fascinating and interesting, very intelligent, very well read, very opinionated. But a lot of people distrusted him. He had an interesting background. Before he had any money, or before he came into money, he'd actually lived on a Scottish island for the first 7 years of his married life. And he'd studied all kinds of different, he'd studied agriculture, botany, maths, mathematics, architecture, and he'd read extensively. because there wasn't much else to do on this Scottish island. So it was a bit like lockdown. He looked out for something to do, and he'd educated himself far more than most people in those days were educated. Even people who were regarded as highly educated and had been to public school, it was basically the classics that they did. It was Latin and Greek. They didn't know all the things that we know because they didn't have that kind of an education. Lord Bute was known for his fine legs, and the people who did the cartoons in those days, the cartoonists had a field day with his legs, because he was very conceited, very vain about his legs. And the portraits, most of the portraits painted in later life show off the legs. So people, they don't tease him face to face because he wasn't that sort of a person that you could laugh about it and have a bit of banter. Absolutely no way. But the cartoonists just, when he became unpopular, that was what they mocked and parodied his legs. He was very sophisticated, or he was thought to be very sophisticated, and Prince Frederick was very worried about his firstborn, future king, George, because George wasn't having a very happy adolescence. He was very tongue-tied, very shy, appeared to be very very sullen or sulky. He didn't speak. He didn't always answer when people spoke to him because the poor child was trying to think of something intelligent to say, and he wasn't very quick-witted or very quick thinking. And then he couldn't think of anything sensible to say, and so he hung his head and didn't say anything. And so people were beginning to talk about him in a very adverse manner. And this is our future king. What's wrong with him? We might say, well, he was just being a typical teenager, but in fact, it was more than that. He felt that he was stupid. He had very low, we would now call it low self-esteem. And his father was very concerned about him. So the idea was that Lord Bute, who had confidence, massive amounts of self-confidence and self-esteem, with plenty to spare, would be a good companion for George. Bring him out of himself, make him have more confidence, and sort of train him in social skills. We'd use that phrase today, social skills, which poor George didn't have. So that's what happened. He became the young prince's tutor and companion. And George flourished under Bute's training, became very, very attached to him, which is really quite sad that this boy was lonely, hadn't got any friends of his own age. His mother wouldn't allow him to, mother and father wouldn't allow him to mix with other people of the same age because aristocrats were known to be unsuitable companions. They told naughty stories, they got drunk, they were unsuitable. And so George had really not been allowed to have any playmates or friends. He was growing up a very, very lonely boy indeed. So Lord Bute, who wasn't all that much older, was really his companion. They did things together, and Bute then became very important indeed to George, Prince of Wales. Then, of course, Prince Frederick died, and that made George even more dependent on Bute. So he was a companion and a father figure. And when the king became, when George II died and George became George III at the age of 22, still very, in many ways, very immature, very unsure, still very unsure of himself. He sort of clung to Lord Bute as the only person that could help him through what he regarded as an absolute disaster. He thought that his grandfather, who seemed very strong and healthy, was going to live for many more years, and George would have time to mature and become better at public speaking and thinking quickly. He was absolutely horrified to discover that his grandfather had died rather than unexpectedly and suddenly, and he, George, was king. We would be thinking, well, 22 is mature, but he actually wasn't, and he was very aware of it. But he felt absolutely unprepared and in a state of panic, and he realised he got this great burden thrust upon him before he was ready. So Bute was even more important to him. Bute and his mother were the two guiding lights in his life. He didn't realise he was being dominated. He didn't realise he was being controlled at that stage. He wanted to be controlled. He wanted to be told what to do and what to say. Lots of nasty comments. You can imagine the press having a field day. Very, very powerful press in those days. One of the things that we were proudest of as a country was that we had a free press. The government could not control the press or the cartoonists. And some of the cartoons were really, really awful, really gross. They actually wouldn't be printed today. So the 18th century, free speech was freer then than it is now. And there were all sorts of rumours going on. The Princess Augusta, the Queen Mother, although they didn't use that phrase, but the Queen Mother, and Bute were having an affair. Lots and lots of cartoons about sneaking into bedrooms and also, well, much worse than that. But that didn't make any difference to George. He was just happy that somebody was guiding him and helping him and telling him what to do and how to behave. And Bute began to abuse this position in a very arrogant way. He was a very arrogant man, very arrogant, which is why people disliked him so intensely. He was very aware of his privileged position and he abused it. For example, George sent 3 messages to Bute asking him for an urgent audience, and Bute just took no notice and went on talking to another politician and ignored, and the servants who were running about bringing this message, you know, the king requires to see you urgently, reported back, Lord Bute's deep in conversation. He didn't even say anything. He didn't even say, you know, give me 5 minutes or tell the king I can't come now, I'll come in half an hour. He didn't say anything. That was beyond discourteous. That was showing off and saying, oh, I've got this authority over him. You know, I don't have to be courteous. I don't have to be respectful. I'm in charge, basically. You know, I am more or less, I'm the king. I'm ruling, and he does what I say. This made Bute even more unpopular, the feeling that he was exploiting his position, exploiting it in an unkind way. People felt quite protective towards the young king, because they could see how uneasy and how unsure of himself he actually was. And so Bute's behaviour was, however he regarded it, was seen as very, very wrong indeed. So he made more enemies, more and more enemies. The king defended his, well, more than friend. I mean, some of the letters he wrote to Bute are sort of extravagant in his praise and his need for him. You know, don't ever leave me, don't ever leave me. I don't know what I'd do if you left me. I wouldn't be able to cope at all. Those kind of letters, which of course added to Bute's conceit and vanity. And then gradually, George began to mature. He was married. Again, it was Augusta, Princess Augusta and Bute who arranged his marriage. But once he was married, and a baby on the way after only 8 weeks of marriage, George began to feel a little bit more confident. As well he might, married man with a baby on the way. And when the baby was born, and it was a boy, that did even more for his self-worth and self-confidence. It produced an heir. And a year later, the spare came along. Poor Queen Charlotte spent the next 20 years producing 15 children. And then when she was 39, she decided she'd had enough. But I mean, incredible. She was just pregnant all the time. And that actually helped George no end. To feel that he was doing his bit for the country, he was producing all these, lots of sons, lots of spares, lots of, an heir and lots of spares. This gave him a lot of self-confidence. And the more he gained in confidence, the less he needed Bute. He also became aware that Bute was very unpopular with other politicians and in the country. Mainly, well, not mainly, but one of the powerful reasons was that he was Scottish. So apologies to Scottish people. At the time, we hadn't really come to terms with the Scots. We still saw them, many people still saw them as enemies or on the make. Again, if you look at the press, if you look at the cartoons at the time, a lot of hostility towards the Scots. They were seen as disloyal because of the Jacobite rebellions, 1715, 1745. The Scots were definitely dodgy. They weren't traitors exactly, but they weren't totally loyal to the crown. They weren't totally loyal to the Hanoverians. They were also seen as coming to this country as almost as immigrants and then taking over jobs that some of the English could do. There was actually a kind of racist element. This affected quite a number of famous Scots, like James Watt. Very aware that he was not really accepted. He was Scottish and he'd come to this country and made good. Why didn't he go back to Scotland? So it's hard again for us to, well, maybe it isn't, but I find it hard to imagine that situation where we've seen the Scots as foreigners. And Bute was a Scot. So gradually, the attacks on the government increased. John Wilkes particularly, and we're going to do a section on John Wilkes. So there were various reasons why Bute became Prime Minister in the first place. First of all, the Duke of Newcastle had resigned. The Duke of Newcastle is an interesting character, very, very eccentric. Famous for, at George's coronation, Newcastle was paranoid about his health. He was a complete hypochondriac, always imagining he was ill and terrified of getting a chill. He got this obsession about chills. So at the King's coronation, the Duke of Newcastle decided it was cold in Westminster Abbey and he was going to get a chill, even though he was covered in very expensive robes and fur, etc. And so he stood on another peer's robes because he thought his feet were getting cold and that's how he was going to get a chill and then he would die of pneumonia. So this poor guy, whose robe he was standing on, couldn't move. He kept asking the Duke of Newcastle to move and he wouldn't because he was so frightened of getting a chill. And everybody thought how ludicrous that there he was standing like a small child, standing on somebody else's robe so they couldn't move because he was so worried about his health. And also, when he did step off the robe finally, ran about with his eyeglass, looking very closely at everybody, sort of examining them as though they were sort of like insects or something, behaving very, very strangely, a very odd person. He resigned. The great commoner, the elder Pitt, and Martin found a very good picture of him. He had resigned owing to ill health. He got gout very, very badly. His legs were all bandaged up. He could barely walk. And he'd also had what we now call, oh, perhaps not now, but we used to say a nervous breakdown. His health had totally broken down. And then disagreements about the 7 Years' War. They were because the 7 Years' War, how to end it, had become an issue. The 7 Years' War was the First World War. When I was at university, I can remember our lecturer saying this really should be called the First World War. So that means the First World War should be the second, and the Second World War should be the third. This really was a world war. It included many parts of Europe, and the fighting took place in Canada, the Caribbean, and India. So that is pretty much the world. We'd done very well in the war, latterly. 1759, the great year of victories, the first time the word annus mirabilis were used. The year of miracles. We will come back to that. The arguments about the war were, should we respond to peace overtures from France, our main enemy? Should we respond, or should we carry on fighting and gain even more territory? We're doing very well in Canada, we're doing very well we're doing very well all over. 1759, the year of victories. Some people were saying, how much is this war costing the taxpayer to keep armies in so many different theatres of war? How much is it costing the taxpayer? Well, the taxes were going up quite considerably. And particularly the Tories, who represented gentry, not very fabulously rich people, were complaining and saying, how long is this war going to go on? We need to end it. You know, we've done very well, let's stop now. So this was an issue, the issue of the day, really. Many people wanted immediate peace. Others say, no, let's keep going. Let's see how much we can get, how much we can take from the French. We hate the French, let's keep going. Bute became very unpopular. He was actually seen as a diabolical influence over the king. People were actually, the cartoonists were showing him as the devil or an imp of Satan. There was sort of Satan was controlling Bute. The kind of thing wouldn't be allowed today. If a cartoonist did that, it probably wouldn't get through the limited censorship we have. Another reason Bute was unpopular was that he mixed with some very unsavoury friends. A friend called Francis Dashwood became the equivalent of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he was a member of the Hellfire Club, of which I'm sure you've heard, the Hellfire Club. Believed to practice black magic and dabble in the occult arts in some caves not far from High Wycombe, West Wycombe. These caves are now open to the public. So if ever you're in that area, I encourage you to go. It's absolutely fascinating. There is a guide. The caves are very, very interesting, and it's where this Hellfire Club met for years and got up to, we don't know quite what they got up to, but all sorts of stories being bandied around that they were holding black masses. They were, well, some of the stories were ridiculous. You know, they were killing people. They were drinking virgin's blood. They were doing all sorts of terrible things. It was a sort of men's drinking club that had gone a bit over the top. And the Hellfire Club was notorious. Even at the time, people disapproved of this. So it wasn't really a very good idea for Lord Bute to have a member, the leading light, it was that there were his caves, Lord Francis Dashwood, they were his caves, wasn't really a very good idea to have him as a member of the cabinet. You know, blasphemy, sacrilege, all sorts of wicked, dreadful things it was alleged went on. So, because of the unpopularity of Bute, the king gradually realised that the man he regarded as his best friend and his tutor, his mentor, his support, George was growing up, and it gradually dawned on him that it wasn't a very good idea to be supporting somebody who was unpopular at home and abroad and among the general public and among his own, should have been his own supporters, but Lord Bute was offending everybody right, left and centre. And eventually, he decided that he could part company with Bute. Bute thought this could never happen. The king was totally dependent on him. Well, very insensitive of him to think that. He just hadn't noticed what was going on. The king had grown up, married man with several children. He didn't need Bute anymore. And he discovered alternatives. There were plenty of other politicians about dying to be prime minister. And George was beginning to resent the fact that his mother and Bute were still trying to exercise control over him. So, much to Bute's amazement, the king was sort of planning his downfall. Eventually, Bute resigned, did the honourable thing. And the new prime minister was George Grenville. The Grenvilles were a large family. They obviously married into other Whig families, so they were very powerful. George Grenville had many great qualities. He was very hardworking. He was very good with numbers, with statistics, we'd say today. He had a blameless private life. That was very important to George III, who was very, very prudish and pious and disapproved of any kind of, any kind of sexual misdemeanor. So George Grenville, unusually for the an aristocrat in those days, was loyal and faithful to his wife. And that meant a great deal to the king. And also, the Grenvilles knew everybody. They knew everybody, they had influence, they were powerful. The other side of George's character, Grenville's character, however, arrogant, obstinate, utterly tactless, and liked arguing with people. He liked confrontation. It was like a kind of hobby, quarrelling with people and winning arguments. He had a brilliant mind, nobody's ever doubted that, but again, he had huge character defects, and this became significant when it came to the subject we're going to do next time, which is the loss of the American colonies. He handled that situation very, very clumsily, offended the Americans right, left and centre, and some people have blamed him, George Grenville, for the loss of the colonies because of his lack of tact and diplomacy. He was the exact opposite of a diplomat. He just said what he believed and bullied people into complying with what he said. He could not see anybody else's point of view. I was proud of the fact. Why would he bother with other people? You know, a very, very superior aristocratic attitude to other people. Other people were inferior and they got inferior minds. So there's no point in debating or arguing or talking to them because they were stupid. That was George Grenville's attitude when the Americans started to complain about the way they were being treated. So George Grenville had, say, many good qualities, but some correspondingly very bad qualities. Now, John Wilkes, who was becoming a very significant figure, came from we'd say now, a middle-class family, son of a distiller, very, very strict upbringing, a very strict mother, a Calvinist, very straight-laced. John not allowed to, well, lots of things he wasn't allowed to do. You can imagine a very strict upbringing. And it's interesting how many people that have had a very, very strict upbringing where they're not allowed to do lots of things that other boys or girls the same age are allowed to do, rebel and do all the things exactly the opposite of what their parent or parents want them to do. They rebel and they become outrageous in their behavior. They go to extremes of bad behavior as if they're making up for the lost years when they were controlled and prevented from living an ordinary life. If you think of Queen Victoria and her son, Edward VII, exactly the opposite of what Prince Albert and Queen Victoria had planned, that he would be respectable and caring about his family and loyal to his wife, you know, and not go to the theatre and not go racing and not gamble. And you know, he did all the things that they disapproved of, and to the limit. You know, lots of mistresses, lots of theatre visits, lots of racing, lots of gambling. And the same thing happened to John Wilkes. He rebelled again when he was old enough, rebelled against this very restrictive family upbringing and became outrageous. His mother even arranged his marriage. Even though he was fully adult, she arranged his marriage to a woman 10 years older, no affection between them really at all, but she got money. So as far as the mother was concerned, this was a huge success. She got an heiress for her son. She got the money. And in those days, when you got married, if the woman had the money, it became the husband's money. She lost control of the money completely. So, what happened to John Wilkes? Well, he started straight away being unfaithful to his wife because he didn't love her at all. Serially unfaithful, producing illegitimate children. Sounds a bit familiar, this, doesn't it? He loved gambling and drinking and whoring and cursing God and doing all the things that his mother had told him were absolutely wrong, and he'd go to hell if he did any of these things. He was a member of the Hellfire Club. You can imagine he would run towards that with open arms, thinking, oh, this is great. Well, what would mummy think? Total rebellion. Total rebellion. Interestingly, women found him very attractive, but he was actually hideous to look at. Famous for being ugly. Again, the cartoonist had a field day. He got a chin which was his bottom teeth extended over his top teeth. And he got a terrible squint, which of course in those days they couldn't do anything about a terrible squint. And he was ugly in other ways. But women found him really attractive because he was fun. He told jokes. He was lively. He was confident, entertaining. And women loved him. You see, there's a complete mystery. Nobody can sort of quite understand why, but because he was a personality. He became MP for Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, and he decided that he was going to make a mark. He was going to be make a mark on politics. And he had a newspaper which he called the North Briton, and that was a dig at Bute. Britain, that's what they called the Scots in those days, with a sort of slight sneer. North Britons, not English, obviously, they're Scottish, but they're not acceptable either, North Britons. There's a sort of implication that they're not really quite acceptable. And people began to buy this newspaper because it was controversial, because Wilkes had a way with words, and he was very outspoken and very confident in his opinions. And he was criticising the government. He was criticising Lord Bute's government. And people began to buy the paper. It began to be influential. And because it was criticising the government, of course, the king started to sort of take an interest. Who is this? Who is this man who's criticising my minister and my government? The Peace of Paris was signed in 1763. Now, I haven't done the Peace of Paris since O-level, which is 66 years ago, so I have to look up what we actually gained, because the controversy, as I've already said, was should we end the war because it was costing so much, and people were beginning to turn against the idea. It'd been going on for 7 years. We'd made spectacular gains, so let's call it a day. Let's take what we've got and be grateful, and then peace with France. The other argument was, of course, was carry on. No matter how much it costs, we're going to get far more by continuing the fight. You know, the French are finished, which they would. There were various arguments about this in the House of Commons. Another argument was, well, it is costing a great deal, but we need to keep the French down. Now we've got them. Now we're winning and they're losing. We mustn't give in, because they'll just take advantage of us. They'll see us as weak. They'll think we're, I mean, the modern word is appeasing the French. Lord Bute actually had the opinion, which was wise in the circumstances, and he proved right from in later years. They needed to come to some accommodation with France. Otherwise, France would simply make peace, but be so resentful. The war had gone on and the peace had been delayed. They would simply bide their time and then declare war on us again. And that is actually what happened with the First World War, because there was a vicious peace, peace of Versailles, punished Germany more than perhaps she deserved to be punished. And the Second World War was simply round two in what had not been decided, fully decided by the end of the First World War. It was Germany taking her revenge. And Bute argued, wisely as it turned out, that if we wanted France to be totally down and out, and we were the ye successful country, that might not be a good idea. France would simply bide her time, build up a bigger army, and war would take place again. Better to have a peace treaty where people were allowed to put the French were allowed to put their point of view, and it would be negotiated, not dictated. Because that's what we did in 1919. We dictated to Germany. We didn't give them a chance to negotiate at all. It was, you will accept this. We are the victors. You lost. You don't have any right to say anything about your future or what's going to happen. So Bute was right in his arguments that this was not the right way to end this war. In actual fact, we did keep quite a lot of our gains. So I'm going to read this because I'd totally forgotten, well, virtually forgotten about 66 years ago, and I've not done it since. I didn't do it at university, and I've never taught this. So Great Britain obtained Cape Breton Island, Quebec, the Great Lakes Basin, and the eastern bank of the Mississippi. French Canadians were guaranteed limited freedom of worship. That went down like a lead balloon. That meant Catholics were allowed limited freedom of worship. A lot of people in this country were saying no, kick them while they're down. A prisoners' exchange was agreed, and French Canadians could emigrate if they wished. If they didn't want to live now, we captured Quebec and the area around it, then they were free to go and live somewhere else. Great Britain secured, now we had gained from France virtually all the Caribbean islands. The question was, are we going to hang on to them? Sugar islands, you know, we'll import slaves, we'll make an absolute fortune. Well, in fact, what we did, we negotiated a generous treaty. We kept the Caribbean islands of Dominica, Tobago, St. Vincent, and Grenada or Grenada. They were mainly gained from Spain. We received Florida from Spain, and in compensation, Spain received part of France's vast Louisiana territory. Louisiana in America, of course, called after King Louis. Louisiana belonged to the French. Great Britain agreed to return Martinique and Guadeloupe, or Guadeloupe. As the name suggests, they were French. That was something to debate, of course. Why are we giving these islands back? We won them in fair fight. We take them off the French. No, the decision was made. Let's be generous. Let the French have those islands back. So we agreed to return Martinique and Guadeloupe to the French, plus French trading stations captured in India. That didn't go down very well either. And the African slaving station on the Ile de Gorée, now in Senegal. Could go back to the French. France was also allowed to keep Saint-Pierre and Miquelon positioned on the St. Lawrence River. Indigenous people in Canada could keep lands not under British control. Only Great Britain could make treaties with the First Nation tribes, what we used to call Red Indians. So we did gain, we did make gains. We certainly made gains in India. That was the beginning of our great Indian, the Raj. We'd won the Battle of Plassey in 1759, and we were we were building up our empire in India. And similar in Canada. But the Caribbean islands, they were, that was disputable. Should we have been so generous to the French? So some people said, no, we shouldn't have been so generous to the French, and other people saying, yes, we should. Now, Wilkes had now become really quite famous for his outspoken and trenchant criticism of the government. And the publication, number 45, became particularly famous. Number 45 of the North Britain, published in 1763, openly accused the government of bribery and corruption and hypocrisy and lying, and talked about the king being dominated and forced into submission by unscrupulous powers behind the throne. So Wilkes comes right out with it. He is totally against the government of the time. The king wanted Wilkes to be charged with treason. Attempts were made to take him into custody and deliver him to the London home of the Secretary of State, Lord Halifax. So this became the issue of the day. Wilkes insisted on being carried in triumph in a sedan chair so he could wave to the crowds. Hey, look what's happening to me. I'm being arrested. Are you going to do anything? Come on, supporters, because he had a lot of support by this time. Different classes were supporting him. Working class people, apprentice boys, seeing him as an exciting new kind of politician. Remember, he was an MP. And so he did have a lot of what's called public support. And he was very aware of it. So he said, right, I want to be paraded through the streets in a sedan chair. What's happened to my rights as a British citizen? I'm not a traitor. Nor should I be arrested. We've got free speech in this country. I am exercising my right as an Englishman to speak out against this government. What have I done wrong? I am not a traitor. Right, everybody, if you're on my side, come and support me as I walk through the streets in the sedan chair. Well, it worked. the London mob. Now, I did a course on mobs. Sort of interesting word. Who formed the mob? Who were they? Who were all these people who formed mobs? Because the 18th century was full of examples of not mob rule exactly, but particularly in London, but also in other places, Bristol and other places, a mob suddenly appearing, shouting and demonstrating, not with placards, but just shouting. Who were they? Well, people have sort of researched this and come to the conclusion that there were people who were out of work who would just, because they were bored, they would hear a noise and just come out of their house and, oh, I don't know what's going on, but I'm joining in. This looks as though it might be fun. A big crowd of people. Well, who'd started the crowd? There must have been some way of communicating. Lots of apprentice boys in those days who were very poorly paid. They could be any age from 14 upwards. They did have time on their hands. They were being trained, but not all the time. And even if they were, there was nothing really to stop them downing tools and going outside. Just hearing an interesting noise, just thinking, oh, I mean, there were teenage boys. Just go outside and see what's going on. What's the noise? What's the cheering or booing or whatever? And then, oh, it looks interesting. Join in. Find out later what it's in aid of, but just lots of people to talk to. And then there were people who genuinely had an interest, who were demonstrating from principles, strongly held principles. And they were people who were working and were willing to just down tools and possibly not be paid for that day. If they weren't working, they didn't get paid, because they felt so strongly about the issue, whatever the issue was. Wilkes being arrested was an issue. What had happened to free speech? He was a popular speaker. So they were shouting, Wilkes and liberty. Wilkes and liberty. He was then put in the Tower of London and told not to communicate with anybody. And his home was searched. And again, this was seen as an outrage. Free country, you shouldn't be able to go into somebody's house and search it. Even in those days, that was seen as wrong. An Englishman's home is his castle. This was the sort of thing that happened on the continent, where they got secret police and horrible prisons. This was not free Britain or free England. So this is becoming a powerful not just a political issue, but an issue about civil rights. Nothing seditious was found in his house, and so Wilkes, quite correctly, made the appeal. What about habeas corpus? Bring out the body. We have this law in this country passed in the time of Charles II. You can't hold people without a trial. And in many countries, you can't in England. You can't hold people without bringing them to trial and accusing them of something. And he was in the Tower of London. So, his influential friends used habeas corpus and he was released. The king was furious because it made him look a fool. He'd been saying how awful Wilkes was. So this made the king look rather stupid. A copy of notes. So to make up for that, a copy of this terrible paper, North Britain number 45, was ceremoniously burned by the common hangman in front of the Royal Exchange. And that was the king trying to get a bit of credibility back, because he hadn't realised how popular John Wilkes was. Wilkes then spent time in France visiting his own illegitimate daughter. We don't know how many illegitimate children he had, but probably quite a number. And because he didn't want to come before the House of Commons tribunal, he was declared an outlaw in absentia, which again, he said, he wrote and said that there isn't such a thing as an outlaw in the British Constitution, in the British law. How come I'm an outlaw? What have I done wrong? Prove to me that I've done something wrong, and prove to me that there is such a thing as an outlaw in our constitution. And he built up a very good reputation in France, mixing with very, very important people, Diderot, for example, but they were nearly all left-wing, we'd say today, left-wing people with revolutionary ideas. So he was mixing with people of like mind. Came back to England, called himself, well, he didn't call himself, he was called the champion of the people, sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, rescued by the mob. He'd become an absolute hero by this time. But he accepted the sentence very nobly to avoid further disorder and possible loss of life, because some of his supporters were becoming very, very angry and very excited, very worked up. And Wilkes was an honourable man, and he felt that he should do the honourable thing and stop anything from escalating and causing loss of life. So 2 years later, after he'd done his sentence, ran for Parliament for the Middlesex. Now, the Middlesex seat was a London seat, rather confusingly. It was one of the only seats that had free voting and working class people could vote. By a sort of historical quirk, Middlesex was more like a constituency today, where all the classes had the vote. And so it was seen as an excellent way of judging the temperature of the people. So the Middlesex election was always very exciting, lots of people involved, lots of free food, lots of free beer, trying to bribe the working classes, not with money, but with extravagant feasts. So beer and all sorts of interesting food was provided. So there are lots of cartoons and lots of pictures of Middlesex, various Middlesex elections, because they were always very, very lively. Lots of people went just to watch to see what happened, because it was open hustings and the candidates spoke to the crowd and people cheered or booed. It was something, it was about like a public hanging. People just thought it was tremendously entertaining. So the constables were always out, because there were always punch-ups going on. Very lively. So he was running for Parliament as the MP for the Middlesex constituency, the Middlesex seat. King George demanded that they could, because of course he won, and King George then intervened and said, I'm not having a convict as MP for Middlesex. Now, should the king have intervened? Well, the constitution didn't say he couldn't. On the other hand, this was a very provocative thing for the king to do, bearing in mind that Wilkes was now champion of liberty, representing all classes, speaking out very, very boldly about the problems with the ministry and the king. I mean, to be fair, he was criticising the king and the influences on the king. But we are a country with free speech, and the king was interfering and intervening, more as Wilkes said, like a tyrant or a dictator. We are the land of the free, land of liberty. So King George said, we can't have a convict as an MP. It's got to be somebody respectable. He is not respectable. Wilkes was elected again. So they said, well, we'll just hold the election again. And he was elected again. And the House of Commons, influenced by the king, nullified the result and said it doesn't count. people were forced to vote, they were bullied, they were intimidated. It's not a fair result. So to cut a long story short, Wilkes tried 4 times and was voted in each time. And finally, in total exasperation, another candidate called Colonel Luttrell was sort of flown in by the government. He could be the MP for Middlesex, not John Wilkes, who won over and over and over again, but a stranger. So you can see where this is going. This is really coming down to who's going to win here. Is it the king and his supporters, or is it John Wilkes representing the common man? The votes: 1,143 for Wilkes, 296 for Luttrell. The king had interfered, employed bribery and unconstitutional influence. His popularity slumped dramatically, as you'd expect. The people saw the king as he was no longer behaving like a constitutional monarch. He was interfering in the freedom of elections, and the king suffered, his reputation suffered very, very badly from this confrontation. What happened to Wilkes? Well, he gradually became more respectable. He continued to criticise whichever ministry was in power, upholding the rights of the common man and woman. But by 1784, he'd mellowed, and he had become a government supporter. And his reputation as a radical protester was rather badly damaged when, during the Gordon riots in 1780 in London, very, 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 very serious riots, a great deal of damage to property, he actually commanded the militia forces. He was actually on the side of the government, putting down this these riots, this uprising. That lost him quite a lot of support, as you can expect. And he lost his Middlesex seat in the 1790 general election, and then retired, and then died in 1797. He gradually mellowed. He realised that some of the things he'd said were rather extreme, and the king had also sort of learned his lesson up to a point. And anyway, the loss of the American colonies had sort of overtaken this the issue of freedom and liberty and bribery and corruption. There were other very serious matters to consider. So next time we're going to do the gradual build up to the American War of Independence, and then talk about the effect that had on the king and on government in general, but particularly on the king's health. So we'll do lots of the American colonies and the madness of King George. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. Again, thank you to Judy. It never ceases to amaze me, the truth of that saying. We study history so we don't make the same mistakes again. So many links with lots of other things. So, a fortnight's time, thank you for supporting us, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Take care.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Judy. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.